public square. As is true of the physician, the judge, the police officer, he has political views and a set of mores. He has been affected by life's experiences and is embedded within a set of social relations. So as he weaves his account of the past, he brings to the work his collection of personal experiences, political views, religious beliefs, and values which converge to influence the production of the work, from what factual evidence is included, to what is sublimated or completely ignored, to the argument itself, from its tone and phrasing to its very substance. We would like to think that the historian is above all this, that by virtue of his training and commitment to rigor and impartiality, he is impervious to circumstances of the personal and political. But this is neither a logical nor productive set of assumptions. At the same time, however, it is not an altogether ruinous condition, as it is part of what makes history and its writing invigorating and enlivening. Given these verities, it is critical to identify not only the historian's theoretical perspective and methodology, but also the ideological underpinnings. Such an operation does not necessarily diminish nor impugn his integrity. These observations are nowhere more in evidence than in the dearth of histories of the Americas, or Europe for that matter, in which Africa and Africans actually feature, where they are more than scaffolding or points in a primordial past after which, a la Hegel, they are no more to be mentioned, or only mentioned in association with pandemic disease, drought and famine, natural disorders exacerbated by seemingly incessant war, political instability, and tractable impoverishment. This has been our socialization, something from which Paul Robeson sought to escape. To address the egregious, the historian of the Americas or Europe must necessarily engage the Africanist literature, but should proceed with caution. As is true of any other field, there are ongoing and unresolved controversies and debates in this literature. And as I read the more recent scholarship, it tends to be infused with a certain meta-language, a lingua franca, that by its very appropriation frames certain questions, critical questions, employing terminology that effectively establishes the terms or parameters of the debate. Allow me to develop my own set of forensics into this matter. To be sure, most Africanist historical literature is focused on the colonial and post-colonial turn. Understandable in that it bears directly upon contemporary issues while allowing the Africanists to articulate with scholarship concerned with similar phenomena elsewhere. But consideration of antecedent historiographic trends is critical to understanding these recent trends. Scholarly writing on Africa goes back to at least the 19th century, and in the Anglophone world was largely pioneered by early Pan-Africanists such as Martin Delany, Henry Highland Garnet, Edward Blyden. These were visionaries with vested interest in Africa as a motherland or fatherland to which the enslaved and formerly enslaved should aspire to return. Their interests and line of reasoning were adopted by such titans as Du Bois, who argued for placing Africa within a global context as a source, if not the very font of civilization. Du Bois's work is exemplary, given the period and limited resources, as he sought to relocate the view and valuation of the African from one of deprivation and disrespect, placing the African on more or less an equal footing with Europe and Asia. Du Bois as activist and scholar was well known within many circles, but his work was for the most part rejected and ignored by the established academy. Instead, the study of Africa would become professionalized, quote unquote, with colonialism's expansion, the earliest scholarly work intimately associated with the colonial project, indeed often written by colonial officers. But these early ethnographers were not simply recording what they found. Some of them were also inventing concepts that came to be accepted as African, such as notions of customary law, the expansion or restriction of political authority, the rise of whole new ethnicities. Meanwhile, the metropoles were creating countries and nations with arbitrary and, in too many instances, nonsensical borders that continued to bedevil African politics and societies. These issues are well known. It was against this backdrop, wherein notions of backward tribes and atavistic cultures were deeply embedded, and for which the only remedy was the civilizing mission, that the so-called nationalist period of Africanist historiography emerged. Writing in the 1960s and 70s, both Western and African scholars emphasized African capacity and promise, often focusing on past African states as empires. Often focusing on past African states and empires as indicative of what could be. Writing at the height of anti-colonial struggles and newly achieved independence, their efforts were in lockstep with those in Asia and the Caribbean, as well as the struggle for human rights and dignity in the United States. The hopes and dreams of the 1960s and 70s, however, soon collided with the realities of the late 1970s and 80s, with Western-educated imprisonment, assassination, and exile of visionary leaders who were replaced by henchmen who had remained in power for decades, bleeding their countries dry, by shifting economic fortunes in which prices for primary goods and commodities fell precipitously, while oil prices rose exponentially, by politics thoroughly roiled by unrealistic expectations of states whose constituencies bore little to no historical relationship to each other, by corrupt and inept leaders who thieved the wealth and patrimony of their constituencies, all with the knowledge and support of Western donors who themselves benefited by loans offered at unconscionably exorbitant interest rates, and by an international business community steadfastly refusing to invest in the productive capacities of the continent, relying instead on extractive industries while relocating manufacturing to Asia and Latin America. Recipes for utter failure, these measures were followed by the IMF and World Bank in the 1990s and their prescriptions for cleaning up a mess for which the West was arguably largely responsible. Their structural adjustment programs essentially calling for the gutting of human services and cessation of subsidizing currencies in the belief that the free market would resolve all of Africa's woes, the forerunner to neoliberalism, only increased social misery and frustration. This void, or the void left by the West, is now being filled by China, who in exchange for infrastructural projects is given breathtakingly wide access to land and resources. But the basic formula whereby Africa exports raw materials in exchange for someone else's finished products, absent investment in the productive capacities of African people, continues. The disappointments of the late 1970s and 80s are reflected in the Afro-pessimism that crept into the scholarship, lamenting Africa's seemingly intractable woes and relocating the causes. This was also a response to dependency or world systems theory, in which the developing world's challenges were laid squarely at the feet of industrialized nations. And as a consequence, more than the disruption of external forces, scholars began to fault Africa and Africans for their troubles, concluding that notwithstanding slavery and colonialism, Africans had squandered their opportunities, gambling away their future and betting on high-risk socialist experimentation. My approach here is clearly influenced by Triot's incisive discussion of silencing processes. But I'm trying to push his insights a bit further by highlighting the correspondence between geopolitical realities, ideology, and scholarly tendencies. They are in dialogue and often move in concert. As such, there is deep irony in the positions of those who critique the so-called nationalist scholarship of the 1960s, who rail against the agendas and romanticism of the nationalists and Pan-Africanists, but who fail to recognize how their own approach is just as impacted by the politics of their own day, by the failure of the Soviet Union and triumph of global capitalism, by the move to the right of much of the politics in both the United States and Europe, fueled by faltering economies, immigration issues, and the fight against so-called radical Islam. My contention is that if there is justification for critiquing nationalist writers for being participatory in a bygone era, it defies reason to assume that contemporary scholars, and particularly historians, are somehow immune to their own political and social environments, and that those influences do not manifest in their writings. And so it is that much of recent Africanist scholarship historicizes, quote-unquote, ongoing challenges by locating their origin in the colonized and colonizer and so it is that much of recent Africanist scholarship historicizes ongoing challenges by locating their origin in the relationships between the colonized and the colonizer made in tandem, resituating causality within the continent as opposed to outside of it. As the servile trade in Africans and colonial rule are facts around which it is difficult to maneuver, This approach does not deny European involvement.